pleased to open with our first panel discussion, which is reflecting on COP26 and debating whether this was a mobilising force for the AI community. Helping me to do that is Professor Emily Shuckburgh. Emily is a climate scientist, mathematician and science communicator. She's director of Cambridge Zero, the University of Cambridge major climate change initiative. She's also a fellow of Darwin College and the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and a fellow of the British Antarctic Survey. Welcome, Emily. We're also joined by Professor Stephen Belcher, the Met Office's chief scientist. Stephen heads up a team of 500 research scientists and represents the Met Office on science and research technology to the UK government, ensuring that the Met Office science programme fits properly into the wider UK environmental science landscape. Stephen is also a member of the UK's Government Chief Scientific Advisor Network, led by Sir Patrick Vallance. And last but not least, here with me in person is Howard Covington. Howard was, until very recently, the founding chair of the Alan Turing Institute. He's also the chair of Europe's leading public interest environmental law firm, Client Earth. So I'd like to start this panel discussion today by finding out from all of you what excites you most in terms of the projects that you and your organisations are working on right now. So Emily, let's start with you.
Yeah, what excites me most actually is just the wealth of different ways in which AI is being used across the climate space. We just had a climate challenge competition in Cambridge just last week, and we had 12 teams all submit ideas for how to support decarbonisation, and very many of them were based around AI and AI related technologies. So there's really a wealth of interest and excitement around that, and it covers all aspects of both understanding the risks associated with climate change and drawing on the vast wealth of data that we now have to characterize that and better understand it. And then also about developing actual solutions and how AI can be embedded in many of those solutions, whether that's around creating more efficient systems, more efficient energy systems, more efficient transport systems, reducing waste by creating technology platforms that allow different parts of the food system, for example, to be connected together, and then providing information into consumers to help them live more sustainable lifestyles. So it's a huge span of different technologies that are enabled by data science and AI, and it feels as though we're really just at the start of an explosion of opportunities around that, and that's why it's so exciting.
That really does sound so incredible. Stephen, how about you? What are your most exciting projects right now?
Yeah, well, at the Met Office, obviously we forecast the weather and it's looking pretty good over the next few days, but we also do a lot around climate change, projecting the future. I think the way I would characterize this problem is that what we're looking for are really measurable pathways to a resilient net zero. So by measurable, what I mean is, can we use observations to measure the emissions of greenhouse gases and actually track the reductions? Can we measure the effectiveness and take-up of policies? And then can we measure our pathway to resilience, so building resilience to a future climate? So the Met Office has been working with the Office for National Statistics recently to develop some dashboards to chart some of this. It's very early days, but you can see that AI really could play a massive role there. And then the second word I would call out is resilience. So pathway to net zero, and Emily's already mentioned sustainable energy systems. But the resilience side, we know the climate's changed over the last 30 years. It will continue to change over the next 30 years before we do reach that net zero goal. So how are we going to build resilience to those new weather hazards and the extremes that are going to face us? And really, I think the role of the Met Office is to help understand the weather hazards that we might get in this new climate, but we need to understand our vulnerabilities and our exposure to these. So, for example, as we get more heat waves, we know vulnerable people can have health implications of those. So how do we bring those things together? And again, there's an AI sort of element here of bringing together those different data sets through these multidisciplinary teams to really build resilience. And so I guess two exciting developments at the Met Office is we have a very strong partnership now with Microsoft, who of course bring a wealth of talent in AI, and we're building a relationship with the Turing, of course. And I should say I'm delighted that we're a partner organization for this conference. And then also we've just launched the Joint Centre for Excellence in Environmental Intelligence with the University of Exeter. And environmental intelligence is the fusion of environmental data with artificial intelligence to really try and kickstart this endeavour and these opportunities that Emily spoke about that are really exploding in front of us, and trying to just build some talent and interest to confront these problems.
That also sounds so interesting. I mean, Howard, what are the projects that you are also interested in? But also, can you tell us a bit more about the significance of AI in the projects you're involved in?
With pleasure. So I'm going to talk about chainsaws, AI for chainsaws, and let me tell you why. So deforestation contributes about something like 10% of greenhouse gases. The environmental law firm that I chair, called Client Earth, has been established to make governments and companies obey environmental laws. So one of the questions that confronts us is how you stop chainsaws in Brazil and Indonesia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that's not an easy problem. I'm fascinated by how AI might help solve this. So you can find out where the chainsaws are working from satellite imagery and AI to analyze changes in forest canopy. That's great and very helpful, but it doesn't solve the problem. It just tells you where the bad people are. What you really need to know is who is benefiting from the chainsaws, and it's logging companies and it's farmers. Let's take the logging companies first. What it's possible to do now using algorithms is to look at a piece of wood. I happen to have a wooden table in front of me, and from the grain and the knots in the wood, you can analyze the species. So you can tell if the table in front of me has been made from a protected species of wood. If you do infrared spectroscopy on the table and analyze its molecular content, you can find out essentially a molecular fingerprint of the wood, which will tell you which forest it came from. You can confirm that by genetic analysis. So in principle, I could look at this table, have it analyzed, see that it was made of wood that was protected and where it had come from. And if I had strong enough evidence, my friends at Client Earth could sue the company that sold the table for using protected wood. Now, my dream in this context is to get out my iPhone, take a picture of it, and know that the table is suable. That's my challenge. That's one of my challenges to the AI community. If I may, I have another one, which is this. So that deals with logging to make tables. There's another reason for chopping forests down, which is to create farmland, most of it for cattle grazing. Now, there's been enormous developments in the last few years on creating synthetic meat. One of the problems in creating synthetic meat and synthetic food in general is that meat and food are complex things, and you can vary the flavor and the texture and the properties by changing the molecules in the mix. It's a wonderful AI problem. It's a bit like protein folding, but a wonderful AI problem to try and work out which molecules you need in the mix to create something which is healthy and tasty and cost effective. If you could do that for steak, you could eliminate farmed meat and replace it with synthetic meat, and that would solve substantially the climate problem, because you could reforest the land that has been set aside for agriculture. So there's another challenge to the AI community. Let's get synthetic meat right.
It's incredible. I mean, all the projects that all three of you have talked about today are so varied, and really tackling climate from different angles. And what unites all of these projects is AI. How significant is AI to these specific projects? I mean, are we at a stage where AI technology is that advanced that we can really tackle the problems this way? Emily, I'm going to give that question to you.
So I think there's some common tools, if you like, that come from AI that can be deployed across a whole range of different areas, and we've heard some of those already. And some of the advances in terms of developing digital twins is really exciting and unlocks, for example, an ability to look at resilience, which is a word that Stephen used earlier, the resilience of our interconnected different elements of critical infrastructure, for example, at a national level, or the resilience of supply chains would be another example in the face of different potential climate scenarios. So digital twins is one technology, using AI in the way of learning and discovering new key technologies that are going to be part of solutions, whether that is around technologies to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and the materials that might be able to do that, whether that's carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, or whether it's around looking at discovery of new building materials. Cement and steel, for example, are hugely contributing in terms of greenhouse gases. Can we look to develop building materials that have the similar properties but don't have the same greenhouse gases associated with them? So that's another whole area where AI is being deployed. And then we've been talking quite a bit about where AI can be deployed to integrate different data sets and the wealth of data that we now have, whether it is from remote sensing or whether it's from on the ground sensors, or whether it's from individual citizens going out and gathering data and then creating platforms to engage those citizens in the solution. So not only are they contributing data, but they're also contributing to the solution. And that might be, for example, in some of the deforestation projects that Howard was mentioning there, and tapping into Indigenous knowledge, but at the same time empowering those Indigenous communities. So there's a real wealth of different ways in which AI is already being used, and the key thing here is about how do we bring together that AI expertise with the domain expertise, because in each of the different examples, and Howard gave the example of the table in front of him and analysing that table in front of him, but it's about bringing together the domain knowledge together with the technical capability that AI enables, that really unlocks the potential here.
Yes, I mean, Stephen, I think it's always been assumed that Met Office data there's a lot of data in what you're processing. So how is technology changing as AI advances?
Yeah, Sheena, that's a really great question, actually. So the way that we do our end of the subject has traditionally been through the solving the laws of physics on a big computer. And really, AI is a new tool in the toolbox to help us. And so I think the question for my end of the community is, how do we bring to bear the new tools of AI, which are obviously incredibly powerful, and fuse those with the traditional physics-based modeling? So I would say that explainability of AI is a really important element. If we're going to use AI to help understand what the extreme rainfall might look like in different parts of the world, we need to explain what that AI toolkit is, why it's telling us what it's telling us. In the physics-based modeling, we have ways of doing that. So explainable AI is a really exciting area that we're following very closely and trying to support. Your question about data sets is a really important one, and they are big data sets. And I think it is really, as Emily said, it's about bringing different data sets together now. And so the large data platforms that we now have with the AI tools is another massive opportunity, I would say. One of the technical issues that we're confronting is that different communities have different platforms that they use to store their data. So traditionally, the meteorological community built its own data platforms, whereas we're increasingly moving to Amazon Web Services or Google or Microsoft, the big hyperscalers. But how do we actually make these platforms interoperable, the existing bespoke ones versus these public clouds? So there's some really neat technology and standards development and that kind of thing that we need to develop there.
Gosh, I mean, lots of data to process. Howard, as the founder of the Alan Turing Institute, you must have seen a lot of success stories along the way. So looking back over the last 10 years, what would you say have really allowed us to reach that goal of net zero?
So one of the great things about innovation is serendipity. We have wonderful scientists in the UK who do fabulous work, and they may not quite understand where the application of that work is until something is developed and somebody from a particular domain says, wow, we could use that over in our domain. And I want to give an example of that, if I may, which is fish recognition. Fish recognition is like face recognition, same kind of algorithms, only you recognize fish. Fish are a problem because carbon dioxide emissions acidify the oceans, and acidified oceans change the conditions for fish to develop. What has been set up now in some places are sensors on trawlers that monitor the catch as it is brought in live. You can imagine a big net full of flapping fish. What adapted face recognition technology can do is recognize the fish in the catch and quickly do a sample and a statistical analysis that says how many protected species are in the catch. When the trawler captain fills in his record, he of course says there were almost no protected species in the catch. The fish recognition evidence is quite different quite often. And again, that leads to the possibility of enforcing proper behavior. Now, I tell you that because it is serendipitous. iPhones have led to this amazingly fast development of face recognition technology and other technologies. One of the things that I think the community should do is interface with as many domain groups as possible just to see where the serendipitous applications could be. It is the applications which will save the world.
And actually, on that point, what are the sort of common goals in terms of improving efficiency of all the different AI research community groups working on different things? Do you have suggestions of how we can sort of have a common goal, essentially?
You want me to take that first?
Yeah, why don't we start with
you? So, I mean, the Alan Turing Institute was set up specifically for that, to be a focus, or perhaps even the rock on which AI in the UK could be built. And it's been very successful at that. I mean, we started with a small number of universities. We've now got a large number of universities. The researchers that come to the Alan Turing Institute love being there because the Institute breaks down not only the barriers, if there are barriers between universities, but it breaks down the barriers between departments and disciplines within universities. Once you get to the Alan Turing Institute, you sit with everybody. Mathematicians sit with biologists or whatever the case may be, and social scientists. That's all done, that's all been very, very good. There is, however, a resistance, I think, in academia generally, this is not a Turing-specific problem, to driving innovation, by which I mean creating products and services that will have real-world impact. Now, I'm sure that my academic colleagues would push back on me for saying that, but the statistics are quite clear. The UK does absolutely brilliant research. It's up with, in AI, it's up with China, it's up with the US, but it is nowhere near as good as China or the US at converting that research into applications that have impact. If one's discussing climate change and indeed the loss of biodiversity, it is immediate impact that will save us, not brilliant research and papers.
And actually opening that up to Stephen and Emily, I see your hand up there. I wanted to know more about whether the private sector is doing enough in this space.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could just jump in with some of both the underpinning infrastructure and then also the private sector side of things. So there's a couple of things that we've been doing recently in Cambridge that are around helping support that underpinning infrastructure. And the first thing is that we have a large PhD program now on AI and environmental risk, and we have about 50 PhD students in that program who are all creating new ideas. So there's a lot of enthusiasm in terms of starting to create that underpinning research. We've also just launched a new Institute of Computing for Climate Science in the university, and that's about bringing in research software engineers to support the development of AI capacity relevant to climate science, not just in Cambridge, but actually supporting projects globally as well. And I think that that's going to be something that if we're really going to continue to expand in terms of developing AI in the climate area, we really need that capability underpinning in terms of that research software engineer to realize the potential for the academic scientists to then be able to take their various ideas forwards. In terms of the private sector, again, when I started off, the very first comments that I made in this session was around a competition, essentially a business pound competition that we'd hosted in the university just a couple of weeks ago. And we had a huge number of teams that came together from across the university to participate in that competition. I think that there is a real desire to take ideas from the university out into the real world. And there's a long history in places like Cambridge of that happening in other areas, in the tech area more generally, and in the biotech area. And what we really need to do now, if we're to really accelerate the transition to a climate resilient net zero future, is to support that green innovation and really to find ways of accelerating exactly those ideas that are going to be the solutions of the future to come off the desks of research desks of universities around the world and out into rapid real world deployment. And digital technologies generally provide a real opportunity for many of the solutions that are going to be critical to that future.
So then what would be the call to action for the AI community in terms of reaching this goal of net zero?
I think the main call to action from my perspective is that if you're from the AI community, there is a host of really exciting but also really worthwhile applications where that AI can be deployed in interesting ways, but ways that will but really help create a better future. At the same time, as there being real economic potential as well, in terms of those ideas and innovations, because if they're going to be central to and critical to a future economy, then there's opportunity to make money on the back of them as well.
And Stephen, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think, there's a thread here, right, of moving to solutions, and there's no doubt the research agenda is shifted very heavily towards what are the solutions. We know the climate's warming, we know it's greenhouse gases, we know we need to get to net zero. And I think the Paris COP really underscored this, in the Glasgow meeting we had last year in the UK, really confirmed this shift. So what's the call and what's the attraction for AI specialists? Well, as you started in your introduction, Sheeny, this is one of the greatest problems facing humanity, and we all want to make our research useful. So that's a great kind of galvanizing rallying call. The second thing is that it's a very data-rich problem, right? And to do AI, we need good quality data. I may live to regret this, but some of the ethical issues around data that we have maybe in the health sphere are not so difficult to overcome in the environmental sphere. So there's good data and it's openly accessible, and we need to really ensure that it is open accessible. The climate projections from the Met Office certainly are. What do we need to do to draw people in? Well, conferences like this that talk about some of the technical things that we do need to solve are a great start. Hackathons, which Emily mentioned earlier, we've been developing a set of hackathons, and they've been a really great way of engaging with new audiences and rapidly producing sort of toy solutions to problems, which we hope will sort of gather pace and momentum. And then on the private sector, I think that different private sector organizations are really looking to engage in different ways. So the example maybe I would pull out is the reinsurance industry. So this is an industry that's very used to data analytics, very quantitative in its thinking, and has been very quick to adopt the very quantitative numerical data that we can offer now on future climates, so they can then build into their insurance calculations for future hurricanes in the Atlantic sector, say, or in flooding events in Europe, wherever it might be. So there's no single magic bullet here. We've got to just keep talking about what the problems are, finding new mechanisms to bring those multidisciplinary teams together. And that will be my main message. Emily's already said it, and so has Howard. These are problems that require a huge range of people from different backgrounds to be brought together to build these solutions to arguably the biggest challenge that humanity faces.
And trusting in serendipity as well as people collect their data. This is a great point at which to open our audience poll. So you will have an opportunity to chime in with your own opinions and takes on the question of, do you think COP26 was successful at mobilising the UK on the path towards net zero? Let us know your comments and thoughts on that. And don't forget that we have an audience Q&A in the last few minutes of this session, so please do submit your questions via Slido. So Howard, to you, you briefly mentioned there earlier this idea of what we can do here in the UK and the global reach of AI. Do you want to expand on that point?
Okay, so in the UK we are absolutely brilliant at science, and certainly absolutely brilliant at AI and data science. And the papers we publish are amongst the leading papers in the world. However, the UK accounts for something like 1% of emissions and 1% of biodiversity, for that matter. If we want to contribute to the solution of a global problem like climate change or biodiversity loss, there is absolutely no point working on solutions that are limited in their application to what goes on in the UK. We need to think globally. We need to think, what is it that people in countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia need to help them curb their emissions and the destructions of, and their own destructions of nature. So in seeking applications for the great research that we do, we should look outside of the UK, well outside of the UK, and see what we can do to tackle the global problem. We are brilliant. We can make a major contribution to tackling the global problem.
So I'm going to open up to Emily. I'll bring you in.
Well, I was just going to add that so the most recent IPCC report, the second working group, reported just a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that was highlighted in that report was that almost 50% of the global population lives in climate vulnerable hotspots, where I think there's a real opportunity for the UK and the UK research community to contribute is in terms of helping to inform how all those people living in climate vulnerable hotspots can build resilience. How can we contribute to the understanding of how to adapt to the climate change that is already, unfortunately, in store. And in fact, many of those communities are already being badly affected by the impacts of climate change today, and how they can build resilience to climate change into the future. So it's about creating solutions to climate change in terms of reduced emissions, but it's also about how we inform adaptation and building resilience.
Stephen, you're nodding away there. Would you like to add?
I certainly am nodding. I mean, I think one of the other inspiring things here is that if done in the right way, then solutions to climate change and building resilience and transition to net zero also hit many of the sustainable development goals of the UN. So this is actually, if we get this right, we're building a better world in so many different ways. We've already mentioned food security, and clearly climate change has a role to play in that. Water security, clearly the climate is what delivers our rainfall and drives the water cycle, but it's so fundamental to many parts of the world, especially developing countries. So really, I think, Howard, you're absolutely right, it's a global problem, but I would add a slight nuance. It's an international problem, and by that, what I mean is, the problems are distinct in different parts of the world and require distinctive solutions and interventions to address the problems in different parts of the world. So maybe on one level, this is adding to the dauntedness of the problem, but maybe on the other hand, it's adding to the richness of the problems that we can address. And clearly AI has an enormous role to play here. Partly because it's so transferable, it's relatively scalable, and all parts of the world have access to digital technologies to some degree now.
So we have a few questions from our audience in the last few minutes of this session. Let me know who feels best to answer these questions that have come in. So our first one is, on serendipitous applications, is AI expertise a rate-limiting factor for novel application development? Are easier frameworks the key to greater impact?
Are you looking at me?
Whoever would like to answer.
Look, I, as always, I will boldly go where probably I shouldn't. I think AI could be a rate-limiting factor in some areas, and I'll give you an example of one. There are developments going on now in digital chemistry. So one of the important transitions that the world is going to have to go through beside the energy transition is a materials transition, using material, going from existing materials to new ones which have great properties but are less damaging either to the climate or to the environment or both. To design new materials takes a long time if you have to proceed by clever guesswork and then trial and error. Digital chemistry is emerging, where you use algorithms to design molecules with the properties that you would like a material or a molecule to have. You then use algorithms to create recipes to make those molecules or materials. And even and now there are robotic synthesizers to make a sample of what it is you've invented. My guess is that if you get the AI right and the technology right, the cycle for designing new materials and getting them out into the world goes from 12 months to 1 month or even less. If we can get the AI right, we can have an amazing impact on the speed of a materials transition.
Fantastic. I'm going to move on to the next question, but please, my virtual guests, do let me know if you want to jump in. The second question would be, what would be good entry points and training for a complete novice in AI technologies? I'm an ecologist working on nature-based solutions to tackle climate change. Emily?
Come to and apply to do a PhD in Cambridge, and our AI for environmental risk program would be one answer. But I mean, seriously, that program. The first year of that program is a master's level where we take people either from a computer science background and help give them the environmental science training that's required for them to be able to then develop solutions in this interface between AI and environmental science, or it's people coming from an environmental science background like the questioner, and then provide them with the training in terms of the tools on the AI side that they could then apply. And I think that we found it really important to give people that common basis on which to then start to develop solutions. And I know that there are more and more universities around the country, in the UK and around the world, that are putting together similar programs at the moment, particularly at a master's level, in order to be able to provide people with that common training. Let me just jump in on the, what are the key barriers? I think one of the key barriers to progress, which is actually something that Stephen himself mentioned a little while ago, is on the data side of things, and it's about the accessibility and the interoperability of different data sets, and often that is one of the key barriers to progress. It is completely solvable, but we need to ensure that we do have those different data platforms being able to be interoperable if we're to we're to extract the maximum value from the data that does already exist.
Stephen, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think Emily's spot on that universities provide a great role in training here. And several Met Office staff have gone on part-time master's degrees, which we found incredibly helpful. I think the other route that we're finding useful, and the Turing is playing a great role, is through communities of practice. So these are sort of virtual networking tools that enable people just to share good practice and get to know people who are using the tools and opening that toolbox for them. In the Met Office, we've got 300 or 400 people now in our AI community of practice. We're beginning to link that with other government organisation communities of practice, DSTL, and other places. So I think that's another incredibly effective tool for connecting people and sort of just thinking about the spectrum of skills that are required to contribute in this way.
Yeah, it really screams like collaboration and bringing researchers together, and it's so exciting. Another question we have is, do you believe explainable AI will replace physics-based simulation? What criteria would you have to be met to see this transition? Emily? Oh, everyone wants to chime in. So Emily, we'll start with you.
Well, actually, I think the real value is in integrating data-driven models together with physics-based models. The key advantage that we can deliver from the physics-based models is using our understanding of physics to be able to project forwards in a changing world. If we use data-driven models, then we're constrained to gathering insights from the world as it is at present, and that is incredibly valuable, but you need to augment it with that understanding of the physics in order to be able to understand how things might evolve, and bringing those two together is incredibly powerful.
Stephen, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Emily said. We've got two really powerful tools. Why not make the best of both of them? There'll always be a need for physics-based modelling. To give an example from the weather forecasting world, if we had an AI technique that forecasts the weather, we need data to train it on, and that would be a combination of observations in a physics-based model. The climate is changing, so we'd need to retrain that weather forecast model continuously through a physics-based model. We wouldn't have seen climate change until maybe now if we just use data-driven models. Because the detectable signal of climate change has only emerged relatively recently from the noise of weather. So we've got two great toolkits. Let's spoil ourselves and use both of them.
That sounds great. And Howard, in the minute and a half that we have left for this session, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think Stephen and Emily have said everything about the combination of physics and data science. You do need both, and with both you develop an immensely powerful tool. My thought, as I've said several times, is let us encourage the community as much as we can to make those tools and get them out where they can have a real world effect.
So, final thoughts, because we have a minute left of this session. Would you like to say anything to sum up this really fascinating discussion? I feel like we've opened a real can of worms here.
So, this is a world full of opportunity. This is where there is going to be massive demand and massive growth over the next few years. Anybody who has a sense that they would like to participate in this should join in straight away.
Fantastic. Emily and Stephen?
You've heard us say throughout this session, there's so many exciting opportunities for bringing AI knowledge in to help solve, the greatest challenge that's facing humanity over the coming decades. So come join us.
And finally, Stephen, from you.
There are no bad ideas out there, so let's just harness the ideas and see where they take us.
Discussion. Thank you, Emily, Stephen and Howard, for joining me. And that brings this session to a close. We'll see you in about 5 minutes for the next session. Thanks for joining.